Hello everyone, my name is Kayleen Knox and I work in Comcare's Provider Frameworks and Return to Work team. I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar today. We've had a huge response to the webinar, so I'd like to thank you for making the time to come along. You'll see information and links referenced during the webinar in the Q&A function, so keep an eye out for those. On behalf of Comcare, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are virtually meeting today. I am joining you from Brisbane, so I'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people who are the traditional custodians of the land I'm on. I'd like to pay my respect to the elders past and present and acknowledge the contribution they have made and continue to make. I also extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islander people who are present. So just some housekeeping, this session is being recorded and a copy of the recording along with relevant resources will be made available on our website in the coming weeks. You're unable to access your microphone and camera for this event, as you probably can tell. However, we encourage you to engage today by asking questions in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to reply and address as many as we can. We had quite a lot come through registration, so we'll get through as many as we can, and we're spoilt for choice, which is great. Finally, it's important to note that during the webinar, we will discuss topics such as disability and physical and mental ill health. So please take care while tuning in and feel free to step away or mute the session if you need to. If you require support, please reach out to a trusted person, your EAP provider, or contact Beyond Blue. The contact details are linked in the Q&A post. So before I jump in to introducing our panel, I just quickly want to share that the Comcare National Conference will take place from the 14th to the 16th of September in Canberra. So this year's conference theme centres on a people-first approach to workplace health and safety. I'm also very pleased to share some exciting news about our keynote speakers. Yelena Dokic, Mitch Brown and Australian of the Year Kath Cashel will be joining us to share their stories in the conference. We'll also be joined at the conference dinner by television presenter and former AFL player Tony Armstrong. So there are some opportunities remaining to be involved as a partner or exhibitor, as well as opportunities to speak at the conference, with applications closing the 30th of April. So it's not too late if you'd like to apply. We'll share a link to the conference in the Q&A for you there as well. I would now like to welcome our panel members who will be unpacking what workplace accommodations actually look like in practice and what really makes them work. First, we have Ruhee Meghani. Ruhee is the founder of Allied Collective and a yoga teacher with over 14 years of experience across leadership, wellbeing and inclusion. She's known for her straightforward and engaging approach to conversations around inclusion, equity and wellbeing, and for helping organisations create more inclusive ways of working through training and workshops. Welcome, Ruhee. Or we'll need you to turn off, put your microphone on.
Thanks for having me, Kayleen.
No worries. Lovely to see you. I wonder if we would start with you, and I wonder if you could tell us a bit about yourself and share your perspective on workplace accommodations and what you've seen that has made the biggest difference.
Absolutely. Firstly, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm seeing close to 300 people on this webinar, and it's so amazing to see that we're seeing this trend where everyone wants to do better towards inclusive leadership, towards inclusive well-being, which is what I'm all about. So yeah, my background, I studied psychology, business management, took a little bit of a tangent, became a yoga teacher, but I found out my love for facilitation as I worked with international organizations, and I really learned about what culture can do, what conversations can do, and the impact leadership can have when we make well-being inclusive, when we make it accessible for everyone. And in my experience, as an employee and now as someone who runs her own business and works with other organizations, I've seen that it has to be human-led. That we talk about human-centered design and human-first design, but in a workplace well-being context, what accommodations help not just people, but entire organizations, they thrive. So it's the smallest changes when we start listening to our people and we want them to be well because everyone deserves to be well. It creates a workplace that everyone wants to be at. They want to work there, and your employees and team will then be your biggest cheerleaders. And I think in terms of a few key differences that help an organization get there is intentional listening. It's leaders being open and honest and be able to have those brave, nuanced conversations. So firstly, I want to congratulate everyone in the room because this is the first step in order to do that. We're not going to figure out everything in one go or in one session. It is the commitment to be on that journey. And then it's through, more practical measures like awareness, capacity building in leaders and managers to be able to have those conversations, and, things like psychological safety and what the legacy and culture looks like for organizations with accommodations and inclusion in mind.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ruhee. I think we'll be unpacking a lot of that in the session. That was quite a lot in that short period of time. So thank you and welcome. I'll now introduce our second panelist, Andrew Pfeiffer. Hi, Andrew. Andrew is an advisor in the public sector and an advocate for the full participation of neurodivergent people in the workplace and broader community. He co-founded the public sector neurodiversity community of practice and was awarded a Public Service Medal for his work in this space, including efforts to improve representation of neurodivergent people across the APS. Andrew's TEDx talk about neurodiversity has 20,000 views, probably more, I'd say, and he's known for wearing the occasional novelty suit as an icebreaker, which I can see you have done so today. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Kayleen.
Same thing. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about yourself, because I've only just touched on it for each of you, and your perspective on workplace accommodations and what you have seen that has made the biggest difference.
For sure. Thank you so much, Kayleen. So I discovered that I'm autistic in late 2019, and more recently, my psychologist has said that she thinks I'm ADHD as well. So ADHD, if you've heard that term before. And finding out that I'm autistic, it really transformed my life by giving me such a greater understanding about both my strengths and why I find certain things so challenging in life. And one of the reasons I wear the novelty suits is I experience a lot of social anxiety at big networking events, and now I've got a special interest that I can talk about that I'm wearing. And if people ask me, where do you get the suit from, I can launch into exactly what I've just told you just now. I work in the public sector, and I should just give a usual disclaimer that all of these views that I'm going to share today are my own and not those of my employer. I've had a lot of opportunities, a real privilege in advocating for neurodiversity inclusion in the public sector and the broader community. But I should say as well that I'm speaking as someone that's got a lived experience being neurodivergent. I'm not a medical professional. I've got a data science background, which is lots of fun, but very different to having a psychology background or something to that effect. When I was invited to be involved in this webinar today, I asked the team, am I the right person to be speaking at this webinar? Because I haven't actually asked for formal accommodations in the workplace. But one of the things that I often advocate for in my neurodiversity advocacy is having conversations between staff and managers, between colleagues and colleagues about preferred working and communication styles. What are your strengths? What are your challenges? Whether you like to wear noise cancelling headphones in the office and get deep work done, or whether you like a noisy open plan office and have lots of banter in the workplace. And I think that goes to what I think needs to be the starting point in these conversations, which is how do we harness employees' strengths? How do we help them thrive so that they can deliver outcomes in the workplace? Because I think we really need to empower and trust employees that they want to do a good job and deliver in the workplace. And so having those conversations, everyone needs different things to thrive in the workplace, whether that's people with a disability or people without, people that are neurodivergent or people that are neurotypical. And for those of us that might be disabled and neurodivergent, sometimes we have different things that help us to thrive, but I think that conversation benefits everyone. And so that's the perspective I'm bringing here today.
Thanks, Andrew. And I do love the suit, I must say. And I've already learnt from you and Ruhee so many things that I didn't know before. So thank you for that. And then we've just started, which is great. So now I'd like to introduce our third panelist today, Annie Crowe. Annie is a qualified lawyer, the founder of Neuro Access and a leading specialist in neuro inclusion, known for bridging the gap between policy and lived experience. She has contributed to national disability reform, including work on the 2025 National Autism Strategy, and is the architect of the Neuro Neutrality Framework. I practice saying that, by the way, Annie. An approach to workplace design that reduces the need for individual disclosure by embedding inclusive practices from the outset. Welcome, Annie, you can tell us about where you are.
Yes, it's probably appropriate, really. I'm in hospital, as you can see, nursing a bit of an acute spinal injury, and don't worry, Comcare has been delightful, and I'm here out of my own choice. But I think it also speaks to the fact that I know myself best, and for the last 5 years running Neuro Access, I've had full autonomy to figure out what accommodations I need and how to set up flexible working for me, because this is not a one-off experience. I'm in hospital probably at least once a year with my different chronic illnesses and mental illnesses. So, I have to adapt, and things keep going, and it's great, to be honest. The worst thing I think when you're struggling is having to sit in hospital or at home and feeling just like you're not being productive and not contributing to society. And I think that's sort of why we're here today, because at the end of the day, everyone wants to feel valuable and everyone wants to make a difference. And the work I do in neurodiversity is very much focused on the workplace and adults, but obviously my colleagues in this space, a huge portion of them are focused on children and education, and I actually do learn a lot from that sector, including the saying, kids do well if they can. And I think that is also really the same for adults. Adults do well if they can. And I think one of the assumptions that's so important to have, especially in returning to work, especially in, I guess, performance management, is rather than saying what's wrong with this individual, it's saying what does this individual need to thrive and where do they need more support. So really, I guess my neuro neutrality framework, and Kayleen, excellent pronunciation, is really about, initially it started from a language perspective of talking about trying to step away from both deficit pathologizing language around neurodiversity, but then also avoiding superpowers and romanticizing it, like, oh, my ADHD is my superpower, because both of those extremes raise barriers in the workplace. If you're pathologizing, then you're feeling like you're having to focus on what you're not good at. And if you're saying like if someone's telling you it's a superpower, you feel like you're not really allowed to ask for adjustments and the access that you need. So both of them do put really real barriers up, but it's sort of evolved in the work I do with leaders and organizations to be more of a philosophy and a practice, and something that we're always headed towards. And an example is, I guess, trying to look at the individual as an individual and meeting them where they're at, and not pathologizing them or needing a label or a diagnosis to get them the support. A lot of the challenges that the individuals I've supported over the last few years is a massive one is disclosure in the workplace, and I'm sure we'll talk about this again soon. But a part of what I teach is really that to get to the point as leaders to be able to support your staff in a way that it doesn't require disclosure. And that's not only from a vulnerability lens, I call it the vulnerability tax, but also because the reality is that not most, but a huge portion of neurodivergent, disabled and chronically ill employees don't actually know that they have a chronic illness or a neurodivergence. I certainly didn't until I was 28 in 2019, like Andrew. And so, there's that. And then even if they do have a label, a lot of the time they're still unpacking what that means. They might not know what supports they need. So, it is complex, but I'm excited to be here today and to talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. Yes, we do again unpack a lot of that in the questions. We've based our next few questions on our registration, of which we had many come through, as I said. So thank you so much for that, and for in practice in front of us being, a live example, I guess, of how we can accommodate. And I probably don't need to tell you this, but when I throw to a question, if you need a break or you want to turn your camera off for a while, or perhaps if the connectivity is beautiful from my end, but if there's, you need to turn the camera off at any time, just let me know. But again, thank you. What a great way to start our webinar. And thank you again to our panel for being here and sharing your perspectives. I was thinking, I guess one thing we often hear is that people don't always know what to ask for or even where to start. So building on that, I'd like to explore how this works in practice. So Andrew, from your experience, how are effective accommodations actually identified in practice?
For sure. I think for me, like I said before, the starting assumption, and I think Annie, you said this as well, is that we need to trust and assume that people want to do a good job at work, unless that's obviously proven otherwise. And so for me, it's quite simple. Build relationships with your colleagues, with staff that you might have managerial responsibility for. Ask them, learn from them. Sometimes it's a bit of trial and error. Sometimes they might not know what adjustments are available. I'm sure you can get advice from HR teams and that sort of thing. But yeah, it really comes back to having those trusting and empowering relationships between managers and staff.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Ruhee, would you like to add anything more to that? Let me know if you want me to repeat that question.
No, I think it's really pretty similar to what Annie and Andrew have touched on. It's trusting and empowering. And it's really recognizing that, asking the deeper question, why are people not willing or not disclosing if they do know? And then it's looking at what are the stories we're telling ourselves as leaders in positions where we can have impact on accommodations or put into place policies, systems, and procedures to be able to do that. Then from the questions, we arrive at, what are the stories we're telling ourselves? The stories we tell come from experience. In experience, we look at different layers of lived experience and something called intersectionality, the ways in which all our lived experience overlap, right? And it can be, I guess, logistically simple to put people into a bucket. Let's say this person needs this accommodation because they have this condition. However, we are very complex, nuanced, layered human beings, right? For example, I navigate this chronic illness called endometriosis. It affects 1 in 7 women in Australia. Like Annie said, it's invisible. Not a lot of people even know they have it. It takes on an average 7 to 10 years to even get diagnosed with it. So it's about recognizing that every human is different. Their lived experience looks different. Well-being as a whole also looks very different for everyone. But unfortunately, our systems have not been set up for well-being to be equitable for everyone. And we absolutely must talk about intersectionality, the role of privilege that it plays when we talk about these conversations, because not everyone has equitable access to well-being. Whether it's through systemic research, we look at medical misogyny, or we look at medical racism, we look at different ways in which our systems are set up that are letting our human beings down. So it's really about humanizing it and then looking at, we're not going to get it perfectly right on the first try, and that's not a failure. So it's first step is letting go of the fear of doing the wrong thing. And Annie alluded to this earlier of, people have this fear of, I don't want to be difficult or I don't want to be a burden. And managers on the other side, they are afraid of, saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing or being offensive or like offending someone. But it's really about recognizing, it's a human to human connection. You want the person to do well. I want to do well as an employee. So recognizing that not everyone might know what they need in the moment, but it's being able to sit in that curiosity, being able to sit with hard questions that are uncomfortable in the meantime, but recognizing that the intention is there to create a better future so that people who've suffered historically don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah, thanks, Ruhee. I'm thinking, I'm a manager. I feel like there might be a conversation that needs to be had. And what do I say if I don't know what to say? And we might unpack that a little bit more after we go now to Annie. But thank you for that. So, Annie, how effective accommodations identified in practice?
Yeah, I just want to love what Ruhee said, and Andrew would just back that up. I think really, if we're going to talk about, so first of all, there's two things to hold here. One, that we are our own experts, okay? Every individual knows ourselves best. But on the other hand, we don't always have the answers. So putting it on the individual to know exactly what accommodations to ask for or what accommodations are available or understood is really complex. So one of the things I like to talk about is the sort of accommodations menu that organizations should have available to all staff, where they have a list of things that staff have tried in the past, that they have tried to implement before, things that they know can help people, working with the employees in their organization that are in their communities of practice, or advocates and people like me and Ruhee who train people in this stuff to build that up. So that's a starting point that takes the pressure off both sides, right? But then also, I guess, having the mindset and attitude that it's not a one conversation. It's something that needs to continue and will be ever evolving. And also having flexibility in that, in knowing that, let's say that you try a few accommodations and some work and some don't. You're not at an end point. There is never a point where you're like, okay, you're set in stone. They need this. They don't need that. Cool, let's move on. That's just not how humans work. We constantly fluctuate in life, whether that's disability related, neurodivergence, mental health, chronic illness, or caring responsibilities, or there's so many different factors and intersections that might influence our fluctuating capacity, and something that might have worked for a while, maybe it doesn't work anymore. So understanding that this is an ever evolving process and it should be an open and ongoing conversation, I think is really critical.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Annie. So we've talked about identifying accommodations, but to bring this a little bit more to life and more specific, it's often the practical real world examples. We've touched on some of them that help people understand what is possible. You're the manager, you've asked the question, but you don't know, what is possible. So Annie, can you share examples of accommodations that have worked well and what made them effective in your experience?
Yeah, definitely. And I think something I'd just like to quickly add is one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of disclosing diagnosis is because a lot of the time people have so many preconceived ideas about what it means. So if I walk in and say, hey, I'm autistic, bipolar, ADHD, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And there's sayings like, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. You've met one ADHD. You've met someone with endometriosis. You've met one person with endometriosis. We have all of these things, and they're so varied, even within their own labels. So really looking at it from a more practical lens, and why I lead into this answer and this question, I guess, is thinking about, what helps one person or one thing can help lots of people. Let's talk about, for example, one thing that helps me a lot and helps many of my clients, and what I see in the workplace, is having recordings for meetings. So whether that's recorded and later transcribed or just kept for notes, or whether that's live transcription, that can help so many people. That can help people with working memory challenges. That can help people with sensory sensitivities or distractibility. There's so many reasons why that specific accommodation can help so many people. We don't have to say, I have ADHD and I need transcription. We can just say, this helps me perform at my best And, you know, from a lens of a leader, it's like, well, we want to reduce the energy and cognitive load on our employees so that they can do their best work and can, you know, create the best and most productive output. So doing something like this, whether they're openly diagnosed or disclosed or not, we just want to make their lives easier. Same thing with, let's use an example of people who prefer emails or phone calls. I remember when I was a graduate in the public service over 10 years ago now, I knew then that I really didn't like phone calls. I didn't understand why. I couldn't articulate it. I preferred emails. I got really anxious with phone calls. And there was one job I was in when it was one of my grad rotations and they said, oh, just give them a call. And I said, oh, could I possibly email? And they're like, no, just pick up the phone. It's fine. And just in that tiny moment, and I guess, you know, until I've found out labels and I've unpacked diagnoses and stuff, that was the tiny things that we ask for or that we inherently know about ourselves, or maybe we know that they drain our battery, maybe we know that they cause anxiety. They're sort of clues into what we need. So for me, I barely do phone calls anymore. And I'm fine speaking and I'm great on Zooms and Teams. If I can see you, then I'm much better because I have auditory processing challenges, but I also have social challenges as well. So being able to see someone to me is much easier on a auditory lens than having a phone call where I can't look at their facial expressions, where I have to think a lot harder about and process what they're saying, which can lead to delays and issues, breakdowns in communication. Now I'm high masking and I'm able to hide that, but at what cost? I burn out easily. I am so fatigued that I can't go home and contribute to my family life. I spend my weekends in bed because I'm recovering from the extreme levels of output that I'm doing that could be reduced by a simple fact of, hey, Annie likes emails or Zoom calls. Like, it's those kind of things that can really, really help. And I guess looking at it in the light that isn't the diagnostic lens and assuming that all autistic people hate phone calls, and looking at it more on the individual lens of what does and doesn't drain someone's energy or lead to increased anxiety and whatnot. But you get the picture.
Yes, I do, very much so. Thanks, Annie. Andrew, I'm wondering, do you have some examples of accommodations that have worked well, but also some that haven't worked so well?
Yeah, for sure. Echoing everything Annie said, one of the things that I really love about that preferred working and communication styles template that I mentioned earlier is, one, you don't need to share that you're disabled, neurodivergent, whatever, in order to ask to share that with your manager. So I, as a matter of course, whenever I start a new job, will share that with my manager, and then I suggest, hey, would you like to share it with me? Would you like to share it with the rest of the team? Would you like to encourage the team to share it with each other? And I find that sort of thing really helpful because it goes to the things that Annie was talking about earlier, such as what are your strengths? What are your challenges? How can you thrive in the workplace? Do you like to wear noise cancelling headphones or a noisy open plan office? Do you like to be tasked by emails or in a meeting where you're taking notes? All of those sorts of questions, because at the end of the day, different people thrive in different ways, and all it takes is a conversation about what that looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Ruhee, same again, so accommodations and some examples that have worked well, but also from your experience, some that haven't worked well and the impact that had, if you've got any examples there as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to echo what Annie and Andrew have said of when we put into place accommodations with intention and after listening, it literally benefits everyone. There is no downside. It gives people the option. So I want to ask silently to this massive group here in the webinar, have you used voice to text feature on your phone? Have you used an electric toothbrush? Have you used a sidewalk? If you answered yes to any of these were invented for people with disabilities and with needs different to us. But we use these things almost every day and it benefits all of us. So it's really looking at, and that example of, that work with me guide is such a beautiful example, Andrew, because not only is it going to benefit the leaders to know how to accommodate for their team better, but for someone to do that exercise as an exercise in leadership. Leadership starts with self-awareness, and we're all becoming better leaders by doing that. So going back to the question, I think, again, when we look at, best practices and things that haven't gone well, that we can kind of take learnings from both sides, but it starts with a conversation, and we need to talk about accommodations as a relationship, not as a checkbox. Because again, it is going to look different for everyone. And you can use case studies as examples. One of the examples that have worked for an organization I was consulting with was the most simple but the most heartwarming example. So it was a team, everyone was in person at the office. There was just one remote team member in another state. And we were in a team call, and they were in on Zoom online. And we're talking, having a good time and, trying to make them feel included best we could. And then I do something called stay interviews with the teams I work with. It's the opposite of exit interviews, where we ask people what makes them stay. And we ask them some really difficult, curly questions, and we uncover some really interesting things. And what came out of that conversation was a simple disclosure by the remote team, was that, hey, when you're in the office and you're having these meetings, I do see the effort that goes in to make me feel included, but I can't hear anyone because everyone's all around the room. So the simple accommodation we made was we used one of our phones as a mic, and as everyone spoke, we just passed the phone around as a mic. It didn't cost anything to the company. It made the employee feel so seen, heard, valued. They felt more included being in another state. So it's literally about creating space for these conversations. Something that I had to relearn as a leader is that answers are already in the room, which more often than not, they are. As a facilitator, I will agree, but not everyone knows exactly what they need. It is our responsibility to a certain extent to educate ourselves, to be in that conversation of, hey, I'm not an expert in this yet, but I'm committed to figuring this out with you. There's a beautiful quote called "Nothing for us without us," and I want to pull up the exact term and the credit. So it came from a central advocacy slogan saying that no policy, program, or decision should be made for a group without their direct, meaningful participation. And it originated from the disability rights movement. So you can't design for someone without including them in the problem-solving process. And that's what best practices look like. And on the flip side, when it's not done well, what happens is, I guess, when you look at people from a deficit perspective, like Annie was mentioning, and the people in charge, they approve or design accommodations as the saviors because they think they need to have everything figured out. And so it becomes this undertone of, we know better than you, and we decided what you need. And that's when we've seen the most catastrophic outcomes, especially in, I guess, contexts where leaders aren't aware of the accommodations that need to happen. And some of them can be very layered, very nuanced. For example, being able to use different languages in staff rooms. Is that a yes? Is that a no? Like, what's the protocol there? So it's really about asking the question and not making it tokenistic or clinical.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Before I come back to you, Annie, on examples, if you have any, of where things, weren't handled very well or were missing, just a reminder to our audience, please do, whilst we've got these questions ready to go from the registration to start us off, if something pops up, or you did put a question in the registration and we haven't asked it yet, feel free to pop that in the Q&A, because we've got plenty of time after this to go to some of those live questions. So Annie, do you have any examples of where things weren't handled quite as well, and was there an impact?
Yeah, too many, sadly. I'm actually brought in from both layers, from supporting a neurodivergent individual or leaders in these situations, usually when stuff has hit the fan. So it's very reactive. We need help. Things aren't going well. And I think one of the themes that I see is really that it seems to be almost, and like Ruhee said, it's very relational based, right? So if an individual has said that they need a certain accommodation and it's either been given but not to the extent needed, or maybe it's actually been dismissed. A lot of the time what I see, and I've done this myself back in the day when I worked for other people, is you sort of, you put your toe in the water. So you start to say, okay, I'm going to ask for this and express this need. I'm going to see the reaction I get. And if the reaction is good, okay, I'm going to put my next need out there. But if the reaction isn't good for any reason, intentional or unintentional, then all of a sudden everything starts going backwards. Okay, so that's something that I really see as quite a theme across things. But I guess one of the main things that I've experienced firsthand, and now helping so many people have seen this as a quite common experience, is, and it goes to, again, what Ruhee said about the famous quote, nothing about us without us. I actually had a deaf advocate friend of mine say it's actually nothing without us, period. Not even if it's not about us, which I love. Anyway, I digress. I think something that I really struggled with that I keep seeing is where the individual, and this is in specific reference to return to work, but the individual is not kept central to the conversation. So they're talked about, sometimes in front of, and that can be really a lack of autonomy, a loss of autonomy. It can feel really dehumanizing to be talked over or to have decisions made about you. That is really like, that toxic slope of going downhill. And I guess it speaks to, a manager's role here, and what the difference between being a manager and a leader is. That, if you're a rehabilitation provider, if you're a manager of someone going through this process, if you're not coming at this from an angle of empowering the individual and making sure they are involved in every step of this journey, then it's just not going to be a safe place for them, and it's not going to be a productive place. So I guess that's some of the main things that I see as big barriers in this space, or where things go wrong.
Yeah. In any of those circumstances, but particularly, from my view of being a workers' compensation insurer and in relation to workers' compensation. So in those circumstances, would a manager have a conversation with the employee before perhaps they're going into a rehab meeting to talk about how they prefer to run the meeting, and ask that person, the employee, to lead that conversation? Would that be one way of approaching it? Yeah.
Oh, I think
and
that's
not everyone might want
absolutely...
to do that. Yeah.
I think that's like a very basic thing. Some of these things can be so focused on procedure and so focused on, risk avoidance, that they get so caught up in processes, and they lose sight of the individual, and they lose sight of ensuring that individual feels like they're not just a problem to be managed, but they're someone that everyone at the table wants to support and succeed. So that's definitely a good strategy.
Thank you. So if the person doesn't know what they need, and HR or the people area want to talk to the person's medical team to get more information, that comes up a lot in workplaces, I could imagine. What is the best way to navigate so the person does not feel talked about? Because there's that need of an organisation to have something. Do they really need that? And the person needs to be, step front and centre. So any suggestions there from the panel on how to manage the needs of the organisation when they need some sort of medical information? I guess I'm talking partly from as a public servant, where there are often those sort of requirements. Anything, Ruhee or Annie, you'd like to add?
I do, but anyone want to jump in? I feel like I've been talking.
You go, Annie, and then cool. Ruhee.
Yeah, awesome. So this is another thing that I see a lot of, and I guess another point to raise here is the difference between going to a medical professional that is already that person's medical professional and maybe has a history with them versus sending them to a medical professional maybe that the organization endorses or wants a third-party review of. And I think that's a tricky area as well, because the person that they're already seeing, they've built trust with and they have a history with, and they, to an extent, probably feel safer with that person advocating on their behalf of what their needs are. But when we're talking about a third-party provider that is employed by the whoever, the organization or such, then there's already this lack of trust. It's a lot more complex. There's not very clear articulation of what they're actually looking for or their intentions behind that review. It's not usually very transparent, and that's already putting a layer of fear for the individual up. But obviously some of these things are necessary and important, but I think also questioning how necessary they are, because a lot of the time, and I'm a mother of a kiddo who is neurodivergent like his parents, and what I see in the schooling system that I also see in the employment system is a lot of the times teachers and employers will want professional advice on what to do to support the individual when the individual or the parent knows their kid or themselves best, and they're just sitting there thinking, why do I need someone for you to pay to ask when you can just ask me and we can work together to get this done? And I bring this up because I know it's not that simple, but also I think a lot of the time we're so focused on ticking boxes and going through procedure that sometimes we go down that path too soon. We need to take a step back and see if we can overcome these challenges and these barriers before needing to go down that path, because regardless of which way you go, whether you've got that third-party provider or that consistent medical support, it's decentering the individual. And like I already said, that has so many challenges. So yeah, I think that's my spiel for that.
Yes. Yeah, no. Ruhee, you're going to add.
Yeah, echoing what Annie said, definitely. The systems that are set up aren't transparent. They often are super clinical, and like you said, they don't center the human being. So the first step is, okay, actually get some transparency around why this process is necessary, if at all. Before that, leaders, please believe your people. No one wants to relive and re-traumatize themselves for fun. It's not a good time. And if someone has to fight to be believed and justify their need over and over again, or feel like a burden, that experience itself becomes a part of psychosocial injury or lead to the lack of psychological safety. So it's micro acts like these. And when we believe our people, when we put into place accommodations as a scaffolding to our existing systems, it sends a flag, a signal that you belong here. And we as humans are constantly looking for the smallest reminders every single day, no matter what context we're in, that we are seen, we are safe, we feel a sense of belonging. And an example of an existing system is, let's say, for example, manager one-on-ones, all right? A lot of managers out there don't know what one-on-ones are for. Make them useful. Can we scaffold conversations like this in cooperating conversations of workplace well-being, which is an important responsibility now with psychosocial hazard standards in place? Okay, how can we make this better for you? And always have that as an ongoing conversation rather than an afterthought. It's integrated and interwoven into the system rather than looking at it as a checklist or after the fact when all you're doing is kind of putting out fires. And, there will definitely be places where you have to make decisions in the moment, but if you are proactive and if you scaffold these accommodations and policies, it just makes your life a lot easier as a leader.
Yeah. Yeah, and you often think about just from the moment that you meet that person or part of your induction of someone or the whole team, and regularly reminding the whole team so that it's not just about one person, but that, as you've said, in different ways, it's that ongoing conversation, and that's part of the culture of that organisation from the moment you know, perhaps have the first phone call, the first interview, the first time you walk through the door. Wonderful, thank you. So I'm thinking about the word reasonable, and we often use the term reasonable adjustments. And I'm also thinking about the legal aspects of that as well. Annie, looking at you on my screen. But in practice, it can mean very different things depending on the person, the role, the context, probably the jurisdiction, all of those things. It's not always black and white. So especially when needs are changing or still emerging, which you've all touched on, or the person doesn't quite know, and they're still starting to realise what those needs are, or they've changed over time. So Annie, how should we think about what's reasonable, particularly when, as I've said, the needs are evolving or they're not clearly defined?
This is a big question.
We've got time.
So look, I spent the first 10 years in my career practicing policy and law, and one of the reasons I transitioned into the work I do now is a lot of legal work is downstream and it's reactive, and it's only when things have gone extremely wrong and we need to use the remedies to address them. And I'm a very proactive person, and I believe everyone has the best intentions. And so I come at this from a place of thinking of the upstream end of it. So how can we do things from the start that prevents us, breaching psychosocial hazards with the new workplace health and safety legislation, and, not having to go down disability discrimination or employment law cases when things go very, very wrong. And so when we think about reasonable, the word itself is ridiculous, and a lot of people have no idea what that means, but we need to sort of step back and think, well, reasonable adjustments, it's sort of starting to get down that end of, what are we actually required to do? And you've already got this sort of notion of like, do we have to? And so really stepping back and going, when we are in those early stages of testing things and trialing things and just figuring out what the individual needs, we shouldn't even be thinking about reasonable adjustments. And I know that sounds like very like, oh, okay, but there's bottom lines and expenses and stuff. But we know from the research, from practice, that the majority of accommodations that neurodivergent people need are no cost or low cost. So when we're thinking about reasonable adjustments, we're also thinking about the flip side of that. And apologies for, I can't think of the word. I'm like medicated for my pain right now, but something along the lines of there's an out clause of reasonable adjustments, where if it's too hard for an organization to do the reasonable adjustments, they don't have to. And usually that tends to apply to smaller organizations who, the cost outweighs the capacity for them to do it. Like if you need to install something that's going to cost $10,000 as a reasonable adjustment, and the business is, a tiny mom and pop shop, like that's obviously really difficult for them. Whereas that adjustment may be not so difficult for a multinational organization. But business requirements. I just saw, Andrew, your question. I don't know. Do you want to ask a question for me about that? What are business requirements?
Oh, I just meant in terms of the terminology, like if it doesn't meet our business requirements, that might be what you were getting at.
Oh, yeah. No, that's technically not the legal terminology, but yeah, essentially, that's what I was sort of referring to. But reasonable adjustments, I guess that starts to get into the nature of like, what's the identified disability or neurodivergence. And I guess to caveat this here, a lot of neurodivergent people don't identify as disabled. I certainly do, but a disability, if you're looking at it from the social model of disability, is really about whether the environment is accessible to them. So for instance, I've got clients who are diagnosed autistic or ADHD or whatever, that they, one, don't need to see the need to disclose at work, and two, don't identify as disabled because they've got enough supports in their life, whether from family and friends, and they've chosen careers where maybe It's more accepted. Places like IT tend to be an area where you don't really need as strong social skills. They're really interested in your pattern recognition and your ability to work with data and things that, you know, can really support your neurotype. So there's that as well, where if you put someone who maybe thrives in that IT environment into a an area that requires a lot of interpersonal skills and a lot of talking to people every day, they're going to struggle, and there's going to be a lot of access issues for them there. So I guess when we're talking about disability and neurodivergence, it's different in that how the individual identifies themselves, but at the same time, and this is important to know, and not many people are surprised when I talk about this, is that even if they don't identify as disabled, they are protected under the Disability Discrimination Act. So if they have a diagnosis, and actually even if they don't, they are protected under that act. So for instance, I was in a performance review helping an individual recently, and they were getting performance managed, and it was quite blatantly for their ADHD. So every part of their job that they struggled with was very overt ADHD struggles, and they weren't diagnosed. They were in the process of getting a diagnosis. They were very open to their manager about the fact that they're getting that diagnosis, but hadn't got the formal letter yet. And I'm sitting in this interview with the HR person and the manager saying, this is all the things you're doing wrong. And I said, when are we going to get to the point where you start talking about what support this person needs? You know, it's such a simple shift, but like, one, they clearly have no idea what ADHD is, which, you know, you don't need to be an expert, and it's not your responsibility to go get a psych degree or to be deeply involved in the community, but also like just diving into what people are struggling with in a way that's just like naming, shaming, blaming, rather than, okay, we recognize these struggles, let's unpack why they're existing. Is this job not the right job for you? Is there a few simple accommodations we can make that will make these things go away? It's those sort of things that if you have that mindset and those conversations, you don't have to go down that legalese path where it starts to get stickier and it starts to get, you know, breaking down that relationship. I'm not saying we can't go down that path, but it's that mindset again of, you know, being required to be like, oh, this is a burden to the organization and we have to do this legally. But if you're a good organization and you're a good leader, you don't have to feel that way. You know that if you support your employees, neurodivergent or not, disabled or not, then you're going to get the best performance, you're going to get the most cohesive teams, and you're going to absolutely thrive. So if you're having that mindset as a leader, then you're not going down into the micromanagement of like, oh, we're scared and we're being reactive and we have to tick the boxes. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does, Annie. And I'm thinking once you start to have that conversation with that person about performance without starting with what they need to thrive, then it's probably not, you know, easy to come back. They can't come back from that at all, which is a terrible shame. And you mentioned about, you know, that there might be circumstances where the accommodations, they've had that conversation, but the role isn't the right fit. So sometimes adjustments help us see that a role isn't the right fit, which leads to that conversation about what comes next. So Andrew, I was wondering, how do you recognise that point where perhaps despite everyone's best intentions, the role actually isn't the right fit, and what should happen then?
For sure. Thanks so much, Kayleen. My first thought here is don't be too quick to make that judgment that the role isn't the right fit. Unfortunately, there's still people in the community that think that disability and neurodivergence are problems to be fixed rather than differences to be celebrated. And so I think get the views of the employee. They're absolutely vital. Have they been given what they need to thrive, like we've just been talking about? And then if, for example, the employee agrees perhaps that it's not the right fit, such as someone that doesn't like phone calls in a call center, that might be quite challenging, then really emphasizing that it's not an issue with the employee themselves. It's not that they have problems to be fixed. It's an issue with the compatibility between the employee's strengths and what the role requires. And I think as well, it's so important to be sensitive with these things, because the employee might be really enjoying that role, or they might really want to stay in that role for whatever reasons to do with their career plan or what have you, even if there is a mismatch. And so for managers, I think it's really important for them to be proactive in potentially finding other roles that the employee could really thrive in that are a good fit for them.
Yes. That makes a lot of sense to me. So we've talked about reasonable adjustments and understanding whether the role is a right fit. Ruhee, did you want to make any other comments in relation to those two areas before I move to some of the other questions?
I think both Annie and Andrew have done such an incredible job of covering most of the points. I think it's just that kind of misnomer of, if I do this for one person, I have to do it for everyone, and that key word being have to. If a reasonable adjustment helps one person to show up and do their best work, then, and it's not materially harming the team or the business, that's just good practice. That's just good management. So I think that shifting from the word have to actually looking at, okay, going wider and zooming out, it's looking at the concepts of power, agency, fairness, equity, not equality, equity. Can we trust our people to act within the frameworks, to empower them to make the best decisions, to support themselves, and empower our leaders as well with the resources, with the knowledge, and with the trust? And we know that the higher the trust is in an organization, the better it is. There's more loyalty, there's more retention. I don't need to give a business case. We now know this. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think probably a lot of us understand on this call the difference between equity and equality, but I think, it's probably not a bad idea to remind us. So can you remind us what the difference is, Ruhee?
Absolutely. Equity and equality, there's many analogies, but I think equity speaks to that not everyone has the same privileges. Not everyone starts from the same place as us all. We're all privileged in some way, but also looking at, we might not have other privileges that someone else has. So it's looking at in what ways are people who are pushed to the margins, who've been historically excluded, ignored by systems, policies, processes, history, and who haven't been given access, and how can we create the best possible conditions and environment where everyone can thrive. So it's being able to advocate for those who haven't had opportunities, and also to pass the mic to them. So again, we're not saviors. We don't need to speak on their behalf, but simply invite them to the table. There's so many beautiful analogies, but I think it's such a good practice of looking at the wheel of power and privilege. A simple search will show you, and actually reflecting in what ways are we positioned in titles of privilege and power in, and how we can use that to change the world for the better.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just add, I love that so much, and talk about it a lot in my work as well. So thank you for articulating that, Ruhee. But one of the things that a lot of leaders will come to me and say, they're like, oh, I've given this person this accommodation, and all of a sudden the team have their knickers in a knot about, well, why do they get it and I don't? And I love the example of the pathway, and how we put the lip in the pathway for people in wheelchairs, but all of a sudden it's benefiting parents with prams and delivery drivers and all of that. But really what I say to that is, well, can't you give it to anyone? Does it have to be someone who overtly needs it? Most of the time, like I said, it's low or no cost things. And I think the reason that people get upset when they say, oh, this person got this, why can't I? I think a lot of that is because they've got unmet needs too. Maybe they don't have a diagnosis of anything, or they don't recognize this in themselves. But put it this way, if you didn't have any struggles with paying attention in meetings, recalling what they said and organizing what it was said in your head, I don't think you'd be very upset with your colleague needing them to be transcribed. But if you're upset that they get them transcribed and you don't have access to that transcription, it's probably because for some reason you're putting more energy into paying attention in those meetings and recalling that as well. So that kind of shift in understanding why people might be upset in that way, and also again that leadership shift of bringing that neuroneutrality, bringing that view of understanding that all humans have strengths and challenges, and that any good leader would be willing and open to supporting all of their employees regardless of labels, regardless of overt diagnoses, is so critical.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for letting me add that.
Wonderful. Well, we're doing well for time. So there's been a few questions that have come through. And I'm going to ask this one. This one came through the registration, but I thought this was a really good one to ask. I'll ask it and then we'll work out who would like to answer. So the question is, I know of a situation where non-disclosure of neurodiversity preceded a serious injury during training. So when they first started, how can organisations create enough trust for disclosure to feel safe during the recruitment phase? Who would like to start with that one?
Can I jump in first?
Yes, I'd love to. I'd love you too, Andrew.
Thanks, Kayleen. First of all, not everyone can afford a diagnosis of autism, ADHD, or another neurodivergent neurotype because they're incredibly expensive and, dare I say, inaccessible as well. The other thing that comes to mind as well, in response to the question, is if someone shares their neurodivergence during recruitment, don't assume that you can share that with HR if they get offered the job. I think any information that an employee shares about their own diagnosis, if they choose to do so, should be kept completely confidential, and the employee should always be in control of who their neurodivergence is shared with. And I think ultimately organisations have a responsibility themselves to create a psychologically safe environment such that if employees choose to share their diagnosis at work, then they can choose to do so. But like we've been talking about before, they shouldn't need to have to share their diagnosis in order to receive adjustments and be able to thrive at work. The other thing I'll say as well is that manager capability is absolutely vital, because you can have bottom-up support in the form of employee networks. You can have top-down support in the form of encouraging messages from senior leaders, World Autism Day, Neurodiversity Celebration Month, and so on. But if a manager thinks that neurodivergence or disability is a problem to be fixed, that employee's wellbeing is going to suffer so much. But if they think it's a difference to be celebrated, then that employee is hopefully going to thrive. And so I think, we should move away from needing to share one's diagnosis in order to give the employee an opportunity to thrive at work.
Yeah. I love that, Andrew. Thank you for that. Any other comments on that, Annie or Ruhee?
I think what I'll just add is to that awesome answer, Andrew, is glimmers, which are the opposite of microaggressions. So if you can share throughout the process, even if it's in the job ad, even if it's throughout a hiring or onboarding process as a policy or an example of an accommodation you've made for a previous employee, these are little glimmers of visibility, little flags that tell stories that people who want to join your company or who are joining your company of like, this is a safe space.
Yeah, that employee value proposition that we like to talk about. This is a good place to work because we're going to, consider everybody's needs, and how, I think you've all used the word many times, how we can support you to thrive at work, and we get you to stay rather than do interviews when you leave.
Yeah. I mean, I think everything that's been said is amazing already, but I guess I just want to add, similar to sort of what I've been saying, if we're starting to come across as, do you have anything to disclose? That's already showing an attitude of recognizing difference that needs potential addressing. And I think if we have a bit of a different attitude, if we're showing up as organizations, as recruiters, as just assuming that everyone that walks through that door has needs as well as strengths, and everyone has an opportunity to express how they work best and areas that they need support, then we don't even have to go down the path of asking for a disclosure. of asking if they have reasonable adjustments. I can't tell you the amount of messages I get on a weekly basis from my followers on how they've gone through recruitment processes and everything was going hunky-dory until they disclosed their disability or neurodivergence, and then it was radio silence or you're just not a good fit. And it's like quite overt disability discrimination. That's quite hard to prove because we still don't have a positive duty, unlike the Sex Discrimination Act, but that's hopefully being updated soon with the reforms coming. But it's just something that we really need to think about in terms of what message are we showing these people who are coming to work for us. And some of the advice that I give individuals is if you feel like you have to disclose to have your needs met, maybe that's not the organization for you, because I've seen it. There are many organizations who are pushing ahead and who are changing their policies and cultures and are places that neurodivergent people want to work in and feel safe in. And that's incredible. And that just needs to shift into becoming much more normalized and what we already do.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Annie.
Can I jump back in just with one example of a glimmer that Ruhee mentioned, the terminology that Ruhee mentioned earlier? Give all candidates interview questions 15 minutes or 30 minutes beforehand. You shouldn't need to ask for that, because at the end of the day, an interview is not testing or shouldn't be testing a candidate's ability to hold a whole bunch of examples in their head and then match that example to the horrible multi-pronged, multifaceted question that they're being asked, and then, oh no, I've used this example for this question when it would have been a better fit for the next question. Let's just give the candidates the opportunity to demonstrate their aptitude for the job without resorting to these outdated interview techniques. And that particularly benefits neurodivergent and disabled people, but ultimately it benefits everyone well, including the organisation who wants to recruit the best person for the job.
Yes. I'm not here to give my opinion, but I do agree with you completely.
Can I just share something
yes,
a bit
please.
funny? So I've done many interviews in my time, and most of them in the public service, some in corporate law. And one of the last interviews I did before I had my son and went out on my own was one of my absolute favorites. And it was not a cookie cutter interview. And one of the questions they asked was, how would your colleagues describe you? And it just totally surprised me. And it was, I didn't get advance notice with that, Andrew, which I agree should be standard. But I said they described me as Janet from The Good Place. For anyone who hasn't seen The Good Place, she's an AI that just pops up when you need her and provides everything you need and is all-knowing knowledge. And that sounds super arrogant, but I meant it more. And I was told by a colleague that I was Janet. So I took that as a very literal question and then had to explain it because one of the panelists hadn't seen The Good Place. And now that I'm looking back, I'm like, oh my God, that's a really autistic example of someone who pops up when they need to put input in that might be useful to the other team and, is trying really hard and trying to help people and all of that. But it's those sort of out-of-the-box questions that I think need to be more normalized in interviews as well. Let's ditch the cookie-cutter stuff and give them warning, give them out-of-the-box questions that sort of subvertly made me disclose a lot about myself that was not a direct question about what are my strengths or my support needs, but it in sort of a turnaround way made me open up way more than any sort of standardized question ever has. So anyway, that's just funny. Love that.
No, I love it. Yes, I think recruitment practices do need a bit of an overhaul. And I guess my feeling is I think you get to know someone much better if they're relaxed. They're not on their best behaviour. They've practiced their responses. Andrew, I related to what you said in public service. We have a particular way of asking these questions, and you think, oh, now they've asked me that, and I used that example 3 questions ago. And I don't know anyone at any level that I've met that doesn't find job interviews terrifying. I mean, I think everybody does. So why not try and get the person as relaxed as possible so you can really get to know them and it is an assessment sort of process and determine whether you think they're the right fit for the role as best you can in that circumstance. So I have another question here. Working from home is often raised as an accommodation for a range of different reasons. How can employers work through these requests in a way that understands the underlying need while still meeting operational requirements? Quite a broad question, I guess. Who would like to go on that one?
Happy to go.
Yeah. Let me know if you want me to repeat it, Ruhee.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of a broad question, right? Of what operational needs are versus what the person's needs are. And we've talked about, reasonable accommodation and what is a reasonable needs. And I think Annie touched on that really well. But I think it's reflecting back on how 2020 and events that happened changed our entire perception of work, meaning, purpose, fulfillment, and what is important to us. It's about zooming out and it's about recognizing what are the things, how are the ways in which people's lives changed. Barriers were broken down. Historical inequity was somehow benefiting people who were disadvantaged for once. Um, and it's about recognizing, okay, if that person is asking for work from home as an accommodation, obviously there's so much more, I guess, to be asked around what their workload is, what is the suggested ask. But I think the process of co-design is a really important one to consider here when we talk about human-centered design, right? Nothing for us without us. Okay, what does co-design look like? It's coming up, okay, here are the resources we have, here are the outcomes we're looking for, and then bringing them into the meeting, being like, okay, here is what we have, here's what you're asking for. What are the resources you have? What are the solutions you have? And we know through the beauty of diversity in perspectives, the more ideas in the room, the better the ideas will be. So it's simply that design, the process of co-design, test, reiterate, revisit. So that could be, I guess, a starting point to beginning to solve that question.
Yeah. But I'm thinking that's quite a big process, and sometimes the operational needs have to happen right now. So alongside that question is when a requested workplace adjustment isn't operationally feasible at that particular time, and the work needs to be done. It might be a peak period, it might be there's some work going on in the background, but this has to be done. What good practice, and this is for any of the panel, what good practice do you recommend for exploring alternative or modified adjustments with the employee when it's just at odds with what's operationally required?
I would honestly be questioning that statement of, isn't it actually operationally, like, is it actually possible? What are the reasons why it's not able to be done, or that they say that? Because there's a lot in that to unpack on its own, and there can also be a lot of assumptions in what people actually can do from home and how they can contribute, and the different elements of a team and what roles everyone plays. But I guess let's just assume that it genuinely wasn't feasible. If we were in that situation, then it would be, again, maintaining the autonomy of the individual and the co-design element of having conversations about, what are some maybe alternatives that maybe they're not quite as good, but they could still meet a need. Or, is there something like maybe temporarily moving them somewhere that they want to go to, that might boost their career, experience, and maybe they can come back and then work from home when operational requirements change. There's so many different ways we can approach that by keeping the person centered and also really, really continuing to question those assumptions. And just to the last question, I had just had a bit of a thought on that as well. It's having conversations about, and my mind is like, which question was it again? But I had a thought and now it's like disappearing.
So working from home?
No, I think it was maybe the one before that.
About non-disclosure of neurodiversity.
No, it was the working from home thing, I think.
Yeah, you want me to repeat it?
Yeah, can you repeat the question? It'll come back to me.
Yeah. So working from home is often raised as an accommodation for a whole range of reasons. How can employees work through these requests in a way that understands the underlying need while still meeting operation?
Yeah. Yeah. So the underlying need, that's what really stuck out for me because, again, this sort of goes back to what we were talking earlier about not everyone knows what their diagnosis is, not everyone knows what their needs are or how to articulate their needs. So sometimes it's easy to request work from home, but just because it's a really well-known accommodation, because they're just not really sure what the alternatives are to meet that need. So there's so many reasons why working from home might be helpful. Maybe it's to reduce sensory load. Maybe it's to manage fluctuating capacity with energy. Maybe it's because they can only do the best deep work when they're in their safe home environment. There's so many reasons behind that. And at the very fundamental level, they have to have a safe relationship to be able to unpack that with their colleagues, their leaders, whoever, because it is something that needs to be explored. Because if you don't know the reason behind it, or they don't even know, then none of you are going to know, is that actually the solution, or can we find something else that meets that need that maybe isn't the working from home? So that's kind of the attitude, I guess, the following question would be, is that person requesting to work from home and that workplace that can't allow it due to operational reasons, why are they asking to work from home? And is there a way they can still meet that need while still being in that operational space, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you. Now I have another one here. Let me have a look. We've had a question from someone working as a teacher's aide supporting neurodiverse students where behaviours can sometimes impact performance. So from your perspective, how transferable are these ideas about accommodations to other settings like education? And again, what would that look like in practice?
So for context, I'm a university lecturer as well. I teach Diploma of Business students in the subjects critical thinking and emotional intelligence, which is so connected to what we're talking about. And I think, again, the world is evolving at such a fast pace. And having been on, the teaching side of in the education system, we're looking at teachers who are burning out faster than ever. Tenure is rapidly declining. They have increased amount of admin load and pressure, but at the same time, they genuinely are in this profession because they care about the students, right? Now, the students, we're living in a generation where they have so much information, knowledge, resources to be able to recognize, okay, what is it that we might need in terms of diagnosis, accommodation. And honestly, I think we can be doing much better in terms of doing justice to the future generation to be able to set them up for success, because the world in which they are the leaders of tomorrow doesn't exist right now. So what is the world that we're building for them in the future? To put it in a more practical sense, it's actually assuming that all children, all your students are going to have their own specific unique need. So not too dissimilar to the conversation we've been having about unique co-design, but it's actually looking at how do we start to challenge the ways in which we set up our classrooms. I was in this kind of session where we were talking about, the Indigenous approach to having bush kinder, and why does it stop at such a young age? We are designed to be outside and in nature. Can we start to challenge that kind of narrative around the traditional classroom, and really think big, think creative? And I could talk about this for hours, but that's where I'll start to challenge the way things are done at the moment, because the kids deserve better.
And it's not,
I love that.
Not working. Yes, Annie?
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. I think I'll add, okay, so when we think about behaviors in education or the workplace, but this question was about education, a lot of adults and teachers and allied health professionals will try and solve a behavior through addressing the behavior directly. So teaching them not to do that behavior, for example. There's a very famous ABA therapy, which is highly criticized in the autistic community, which essentially, in a 5-second basic explanation, teaches autistic people to be less autistic as a solution. But what it really does is teach them to be high masking and hide their autistic traits and needs. So it's really actually quite damaging. And from a behavioral lens, there's a Professor Ross Green is one of my favorite people in this space, if you want to look them up. But he talks about how behavior is another form of communication. And actually, if there's behavior that's problematic or causing struggles to other students or them to be able to learn and participate or work, we need to look at what's underneath the behavior, what need is not being met that is causing that behavior. So, for example, a kid who is poking and prodding their fellow classmates and won't sit still, rather than teaching them and disciplining them to sit still, or like saying, if you sit still, you'll get a sticker, like that sort of both positive and more negative ways of disciplining them, we could look at, okay, well, let's think about what could be leading them to do this. There's so many reasons. Are they bored? Are they struggling to sit upright because they have or proprioception, which is your ability to feel your body in space and you need feedback? Do they have sensory sensitivities, or are they hypermobile, which again kind of leads to the purpose? There's so many reasons why that kid could be doing that problematic behavior. And so if we start thinking about those behavioral issues from not at the surface level, but going deeper, similarly, if someone in the workplace is showing up as having some sort of difficult behavior, or we're heading down a pathway of performance management, looking deeper and thinking what could be causing it, and asking them and getting them support to unpack that as well. Yeah. That's a great question. And Ross Green is great.
So we've got time for one more, and I think I'll ask it of each of you, just your key takeaways. Might be one, it might be three, maybe not 10. We may not have time for 10. Ruhee, would you like to start with your key takeaways for our audience? And also, sorry to jump in again. After we finish this, I've got 2 more things I need to tell the audience. For those of you that are still on the line, don't jump off straight away when I say thank you to the panel, because there's a few more things you'll need to listen to, which you'll want to hear. Sorry, Ruhee, could you please tell us your key takeaways for today?
Absolutely. Stay tuned, folks. And I just want to say again, thank you for being here. And I know we've talked about a laundry list of things we're not doing, we could be doing better, or we're not getting better at yet. But please know, you being in the room is that first step. So please don't see this as like this laundry list and you have to check everything off. Even if you can take one thing you've learned from this webinar, it is a success. So please celebrate that success for yourself. So I just want to start with that, because there'll always be more to do. And a phrase that I love when talking about this is that we're not here to be right. We're here to get it right. So if we can remove that kind of ego of it's okay to be wrong, and in order to get there to a better future, we're going to have to get some things wrong. And it's about recognizing that we don't have bad intentions as leaders. Most of the harm in this space comes from a culture of waiting and that hesitancy of being in those courageous conversations. It will get messy, but you know what? Human relationships are messy. They're nuanced. But then on the other side lies connection, lies vulnerability in the best way. And that's the future that we're working for. And another thing I love is the cost of staying comfortable is always higher than the discomfort of asking. So have those, be comfortable with being uncomfortable, but that is genuinely true. And as a leader, you will increase your window of tolerance. You will develop more emotional intelligence and critical thinking skills the more you practice these conversations. And it's not just about accommodations, it's about performance, it's about revenue, it's about profit. Not that this is what we're talking about, but having these skills, these human skills, will actually get better results. So if we move from reactive to relational, we can genuinely see the world that we want to create. And you're doing an amazing job. And yeah, thank you for being here. That's my kind of last reflection.
Thanks, Ruhee. Andrew, have you got any last reflections you'd like to share?
Thanks, Kayleen. I think the key question, what does the employee need to thrive at work, is the one that I would come back to. And that can be done by asking them, but not putting it all on the employee, because as we all know, self-advocacy is exhausting. So having things like a shopping list, or whatever the terminology is, of possible adjustments that we can provide the employee at work. And that really needs to be grounded in relationships, and also thinking about what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve. Obviously, there's a job that needs doing and the employee is there to do a job. But what are the outcomes that we're looking for, not the outputs? And so if the employee has different hours that they want to do the job in, but they're still going to get the job done, why do we care when they're at work within reason? Obviously, they've got to attend meetings and that sort of thing at some time when there's other people there, but not being wedded to 9 to 5 with a half-hour lunch break. If they want to get in the office at 7 and leave at 3 because they're a morning person, there's nothing wrong with that.
I hear you. Thanks, Andrew. And Annie, last reflections before we do our last two things.
Apologies, I'm fading fast.
Oh.
I think, a lot of the points I've already pushed home around, leadership and treating everyone like we all have needs, and how we shouldn't single people out, and all of that really matters, and focusing on the individual, prioritizing that is really important. But I think more, I guess, as an endpoint or a mantra for people to hold is always coming back to, and my thing is neuroneutrality, but there's lots of ways to say this, but you're never going to be perfect at this. You're not experts, but you just always have to try and keep growing and learning, and you will make mistakes. But as long as you're headed towards that end point that it never really reaches, but I guess that end point of wanting to respect the people you're helping and have the best intentions, and treat everyone in a way that really is fundamentally meeting their human rights of dignity and respect, you're going to be doing the right thing. So it is a hard thing. This is not an easy topic. The reality is that 20+% of the population is neurodivergent. Most of us will be disabled at some point in our lives. It's the most transient intersection. These are things that need to be understood, and they need to be, you can't possibly understand them without starting somewhere. And you're never going to be expected to be the expert. So just hold that with you, knowing that this is hard for everyone, whether you're the individual or someone in a part of the institutional rigmarole. But we just have to try, and it'll help everyone in the end.
Yeah, thank you. And thank
can
you.
I add, one last thing? Talk to people like Annie and me.
Yeah. Well, I think this is the beginning of a conversation. I think we will have more of this. Audience, please join me. I know you can't see or hear them, in thanking our fantastic panel today, Ruhee, Andrew, and Annie, and for sharing your insights. Thank you so much. Two more quick things from me. I'd like to share a quick update on the Before Blue program. So if you haven't heard of this before, Comcare has partnered with Beyond Blue to offer a low-intensity cognitive behavioural therapy service for employers within the Commonwealth. And some of the findings you can see there on the slide. I won't read through them, but lots of great findings there. And so Before Blue is available to any Commonwealth employer in the Comcare jurisdiction. And if you're interested in finding out more, please visit the website you can see there on the screen, or you can contact the team that you see the email there as well. I highly recommend you look into that program. Last thing before you go, and you've got 2 minutes to do it and it won't take you long, is we love your feedback. So to complete the survey, you can use the QR code on the screen or in the link in the Q&A, or you will receive that via email in the coming days, in the next week, I would say. Only takes a few minutes, and it helps us to shape our future webinars and offerings. And if you'd like to revisit today's session or share it with your colleagues who couldn't make it along, the recording will be available very soon on the Comcare website. So thank you again. What a great audience and what a great panel. I've really enjoyed today. I hope you did too. Take care, and we hope to see you at the next event. Goodbye.